What does a blocked shipping lane in the Middle East have to do with the fact that you might be renting out your backyard pool to complete strangers next month?
It sounds like a stretch, right?
Yeah, totally. Because usually, when we think about the global economy, we tend to picture it in these isolated, neatly organized little compartments.
Right, like totally separate
Exactly.
boxes.
You have the energy sector over here, the tech industry over there, maybe consumer retail down the hall. We kind of operate under this comforting illusion that if a pipe bursts in one room, it won't flood the entire house.
It's a very human way to process complex systems.
Hmm.
I mean, we crave compartmentalization because it feels safe.
Yeah.
If we actually acknowledge how deeply intertwined these systems are, the sheer scale of the vulnerability becomes just overwhelmingly terrifying.
But when you look at the massive stack of sources we've compiled for you today, I mean, that compartmentalized model just shatters completely.
It really does.
We are looking at a landscape of data that ranges from global crude oil satellite trackers and Defense Department transcripts down to local housing permit numbers, the microscopic architecture of the latest AI processors, and even the bizarre bureaucratic notices delaying your tax refund.
And the crazy thing is, they are all engaged in this massive high-stakes conversation with one another.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to really map out the modern economic butterfly effect. We want to understand how a single geopolitical fracture cascades directly into the price of an ad-free streaming subscription, the interest rate on your mortgage, and the desperation driving the modern hustle economy.
And the connective tissue between all of those things, the underlying physical and digital reality, is the concept of bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks.
Yeah. We are living through an era defined by what happens when a critical pathway is just choked off. It doesn't matter if that pathway is meant to carry shipping containers, silicon wafers, or, the capital required to build affordable housing.
When flow stops, friction generates heat.
Exactly. And right now, the global system is running incredibly hot.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly grasp the squeeze you are feeling on your wallet right now, we have to start at the epicenter.
Right.
We have to look at the most critical physical bottleneck on Earth today. A place where the flow hasn't just slowed down, it has effectively hit a brick wall.
We are, of course, talking about the Strait of Hormuz. Because of the ongoing Iran war, this waterway is essentially paralyzed.
Completely frozen.
Yeah. And just to ground this in physical reality for a moment, the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow V-shaped waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in either direction.
Wow, that's tiny.
It is. Yet historically, about 20% of all the oil and gas consumed globally passes through that tiny geographic window.
Wait, 20%? That is a staggering number.
It's massive.
If you think about the global energy supply chain as a massive, intricate cardiovascular system, the Strait of Hormuz is the main artery.
It's a perfect way to look at it.
And right now, looking at the satellite tracking data in our sources from energy intelligence firms like Kepler, it's suffering a massive blockage. There are literally 130 million barrels of oil stranded in the Middle East Gulf right now.
Just sitting there.
Yeah, the tankers are just anchored, unable to move.
Which creates an immediate physical reality that you just cannot negotiate away. I mean, the oil exists, the demand exists, but the physical mechanism of delivery is frozen.
But here is where the story gets deeply confusing and, frankly, completely contradictory.
Oh, the Washington transcripts.
Yes. When you look at the official transcripts from Washington, the narrative is entirely different. We have U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth standing at a Pentagon briefing podium, looking the press dead in the eye and completely downplaying the threat.
Right.
He literally told reporters, quote, "Don't need to worry about it." He predicted that Iranian defense companies will soon be destroyed and claimed the U.S. has a comprehensive plan for every possible contingency.
The contrast is just jarring. You have absolute confidence from the military establishment and then sheer mathematically driven panic from the energy markets.
Because the markets don't care about press briefings.
Exactly. The market doesn't trade on confidence, it trades on physical flow. And right now, the physical flow is zero.
Wait, but if the defense secretary is standing at the Pentagon telling everyone it's fine, why is the market ignoring him? Are the commodities traders just being hysterical? Or is there a fundamental disconnect between Washington's military confidence and the actual logistical reality on the ground?
The market isn't being hysterical at all. It's looking at the topography and the military requirements.
Right, because when I look at the strategic geography outlined in our defense sources, specifically Karg Island, this doesn't look like a situation you just plan your way out of in an afternoon.
Let's examine Karg Island because it perfectly illustrates the disconnect you're talking about. Karg Island is a tiny strip of coral rock, maybe 5 miles long, sitting roughly 15 miles off the coast of mainland Iran.
It sounds totally insignificant.
It seems that way until you realize it handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports.
90%?
Yeah. We are talking about a loading capacity of roughly 7 million barrels per day. It is the beating heart of Iran's economy.
According to the policy briefings in our stack, the Trump administration has actively discussed the option of seizing it.
They have.
But we are nearly 2 weeks into this intense phase of the conflict, and they haven't touched it. If it's the beating heart and the U.S. wants to resolve this bottleneck, why not just go in, take the island, and control the flow?
Because the mechanics of, taking an island are brutal. It's incredibly capital intensive in terms of human lives and equipment.
It's not like the movies.
Not at all. Military geography specialists in our sources estimate that seizing and holding that 5-mile-long coral rock would require a commitment of at least 5,000 ground combat troops.
Oh, wow. 5,000 troops just for a 5-mile rock.
Yes. It would require an amphibious and airborne assault against a heavily fortified, extensively mined environment.
That's a massive operation. You don't just drop 5,000 troops onto an island without extensive supply lines, air cover, and frankly, the very real risk of massive casualties.
Exactly. It's not a surgical drone strike. It's a full-scale invasion of sovereign territory.
Yeah.
And the analysts at J.P. Morgan note a terrifying secondary risk.
Which is?
If the U.S. disables or seizes that hub, Iran's domestic storage buffer would vanish almost immediately. Half of their national oil output would be put at immediate risk.
So they would be backed into a corner.
Completely. The resulting economic desperation would almost guarantee a massive asymmetrical retaliation. The waterway isn't just blocked by ships, it's blocked by sea mines, anti-ship missiles stationed on the coastline, fast attack submarine fleets.
So you cannot just flip a switch and declare a heavily mined, contested waterway open for business.
You really can't.
And layering over this physical and military complexity is a web of geopolitical maneuvering.
Yeah, the diplomatic side is wild right now.
And just looking strictly at the diplomatic cables and public interviews in our stack, and to be very clear to you listening, we're just analyzing the strategic friction here impartially without taking a stance on the underlying foreign policy.
Right, just reporting what the sources say.
Exactly. President Trump recently stated in a radio interview that he believes Russian leader Vladimir Putin is actively assisting Iran. And when he was pressed on why Putin would do that, he justified it by saying, quote, "They do it and we do it," drawing a direct parallel to U.S. military aid being provided to Ukraine.
And that statement fundamentally shifts how the market models the risk.
How so?
Well, if a conflict in the Strait of Hormuz is no longer viewed as an isolated regional dispute, but rather a proxy theater for a broader superpower confrontation, the timeline for a resolution extends indefinitely.
So the market looks at that and prices and long-term paralysis. And while the U.S. might be somewhat insulated from the immediate physical shortages because of domestic oil production, that paralysis is absolutely devastating the rest of the world right now. Let's look at Asia, specifically India.
The human element there is staggering.
It really is. India is highly exposed here.
They are. They rely on the Strait of Hormuz for about 50% of their total crude oil needs. But even more critically, they import the vast majority of their liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, through this exact route.
And the sources paint a very grim picture of what that looks like on the water. There are currently 28 Indian-flagged ships carrying nearly 800 Indian seafarers completely trapped in the strait.
They can't go forward, they can't go back.
Right. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has actually bypassed standard diplomatic channels and reached out directly to the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, begging for the unhindered transit of energy and prioritizing the safety of those sailors.
Because back on the mainland, the lack of LPG is triggering a full-blown societal crisis.
Yeah, we have to understand the mechanics of LPG in India to grasp the severity of this.
Right, because in the West, we might think of LPG as like the propane tank attached to a backyard grill.
Yeah, just for barbecues.
But in India, LPG is the primary, indispensable cooking fuel for over 330 million households, as well as millions of commercial businesses. It is the absolute lifeblood of daily sustenance.
And because those 28 ships are stranded, the domestic supply chain in India has basically collapsed. The logistics data shows that urban consumers in major Indian cities are now waiting 25 days just for a single cylinder of cooking gas to be delivered.
And if you live in a rural area,
You are looking at a 45-day wait.
just imagine the cascading effects of that. You cannot simply wait 45 days to cook your food.
So what are people doing?
Well, the government is panicking. They are literally instructing regional pollution control boards to suspend environmental regulations and allow the hospitality sector, restaurants, hotels, street vendors, to revert to burning kerosene, raw biomass, and coal. Yeah, just to keep the stoves hot and prevent mass food shortages.
It's an economic time machine. It's forcing a developing superpower to instantly regress to 19th century energy sources just to survive the week.
That's a great way to put it.
Imagine being a local restaurant owner in Mumbai. You are completely disconnected from the high-level defense briefings at the Pentagon or the proxy war dynamics involving Putin.
Right, none of that matters to you.
Your reality is that you cannot acquire the basic fuel required to boil water, and you are being told to burn coal in a densely populated city or shut your doors entirely. It's like the world's most critical drive-through window has just been bricked up.
And this is where the macroeconomic modeling becomes terrifying. City analysts estimate that if global oil prices remain elevated around the $90 to $100 per barrel mark due to this ongoing blockade, it will act as a massive regressive tax on the Indian economy.
How bad of a tax?
They project it will cause India's consumer inflation to spike by an additional 50 to 75 basis points.
Wow. Let's translate that into global consequences for the listener. If the world's most populous country suddenly faces a severe systemic inflation spike driven by an energy shortage, their current account deficit widens massively.
Right, they have to spend significantly more of their foreign currency reserves just to import the same amount of essential goods.
Which leads directly to the depreciation of the Indian rupee.
Exactly. And when their currency loses value, it makes importing absolutely everything from electronics to agricultural fertilizers exponentially more expensive.
It triggers a vicious cycle of stagflation in the Asian subcontinent, which inevitably drags down global trade volumes.
It's a domino effect.
So the bottleneck isn't just trapping oil, it's trapping global growth. And that physical bottleneck flows straight across the oceans and into the United States economy, setting off a chain reaction that is currently tearing Washington apart.
Yeah, the geopolitical crisis has birthed a massive macroeconomic squeeze.
The transmission mechanism from the Strait of Hormuz to the U.S. economy is the global benchmark price of oil, right?
Yes. Because those 130 million barrels are stranded, Brent crude recently crossed the $100 mark for the first time since August 2022.
And what about the U.S. benchmark?
West Texas Intermediate, the U.S. benchmark, surged to nearly $99 a barrel. This isn't a gradual increase, it is a violent price shock.
And the U.S. government obviously tried to intervene. The International Energy Agency coordinated a massive release of stockpiled barrels from strategic reserves around the world, with the United States pulling the trigger on the largest portion of that.
Right, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
They agreed to release 400 million barrels, which, sounds like a massive number to a layperson. 400 million barrels of oil flooding the market should fix the problem, right?
That's where we have to look at the math, not just the raw numbers. Let's break down the actual physics of that release. Spreading that U.S. strategic release out over its planned 4-month timeline equates to injecting roughly 1.4 million barrels of oil into the market per day.
Okay, 1.4 million barrels a day added.
Yeah.
But what is the daily deficit caused by the war?
The global shortfall from the paralyzed Strait of Hormuz is estimated at 8 million barrels per day.
Wait, so we are losing 8 million barrels a day down the drain, and the government is turning on a strategic faucet that drips 1.4 million barrels a day.
Basically, yes.
It's like trying to put out a house fire with a squirt gun. The math just completely fails.
It fails mathematically and it fails physically, which is why the political rallying cry we keep hearing to simply drill, baby, drill your way out of this crisis is fundamentally disconnected from the engineering reality of the oil and gas sector.
Right, because you can't just mandate oil out of the ground by sheer willpower.
No, you can't.
The energy experts in our sources are brutally clear on this point. The U.S. energy sector is already operating at maximum capacity. They are currently pumping roughly 13.7 million barrels a day, which is a record high.
You cannot simply turn a dial on a dashboard in Washington and suddenly replace the output of the Middle East. Ramping up domestic production requires massive, multi-year infrastructure investments.
You have to secure permits, deploy capital, manufacture specialized drilling rigs.
Highly trained labor.
Right. And most importantly, build the complex pipeline infrastructure required to move the crude from places like the Permian Basin to the coastal refineries. You cannot spawn a new pipeline overnight just because the Strait of Hormuz is closed.
Exactly. So we are hit with an energy shock that we cannot drill or release our way out of.
And this shock is slamming headfirst into a U.S. economy that was already flashing bright red warning signs. If we look at the latest numbers from the Commerce Department, they are incredibly grim.
The GDP numbers.
Yeah, the gross domestic product, the total measure of all goods and services produced in the U.S. for the fourth quarter of 2025, was heavily revised down.
How far down?
Initially, they thought growth was going to be 1.4%, which, let's be honest, it's already sluggish.
Very sluggish.
But the revision cut that in half, down to a microscopic 0.7% growth.
And here is the lethal combination. At the exact same time that economic growth is flatlining at 0.7%, inflation is accelerating.
The worst of both worlds.
The genuine numbers for core PCE inflation, which is the specific metric the Federal Reserve prefers because it strips out the highly volatile daily swings of food and energy prices, actually bumped up to 3.1%.
So the economy is grinding to a halt, but the prices of the goods within that economy are rising faster.
Yeah.
This is the absolute nightmare scenario for an economist, isn't it?
It is the textbook definition of a stagflation threat. You have stagnating growth paired with inflation. And the reason this is a nightmare is because it completely paralyzes the Federal Reserve.
Right.
The central bank has a dual mandate: maximize employment and keep prices stable. Usually, if growth is slow, like that 0.7% GDP, the Fed will cut interest rates to make borrowing cheaper, which stimulates businesses to invest and hire.
But they can't do that right now, because if you cut interest rates and pump more cheap money into the system, you are essentially pouring gasoline on that 3.1% inflation fire. You are giving people more money to chase a shrinking pool of goods and a shrinking supply of oil. I mean, it doesn't fix the supply chain bottleneck. It just guarantees that the few goods making it through will cost exponentially more.
Precisely. Monetary policy, the manipulation of interest rates, is a blunt instrument. A rate cut cannot manufacture missing semiconductors, it cannot clear sea mines from the Persian Gulf, and it cannot invent new oil tankers.
The Fed is mathematically trapped.
They are completely trapped.
And because they are trapped, because they cannot deliver the rate cuts that the political establishment desperately wants to artificially boost the economy, we are witnessing an unprecedented historic battle over the very independence of the Federal Reserve.
This isn't just standard political complaining, this is an institutional war.
The details of this standoff are truly extraordinary. And again, just reporting the facts of the legal documents here. According to the sources, the Department of Justice, led by U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro, launched a full-blown criminal investigation into the sitting chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell.
Over a building renovation, of all things.
Right. The stated official focus of the investigation was the multi-billion-dollar renovation of the Federal Reserve's headquarters in Washington. The DOJ actually went so far as to issue grand jury subpoenas demanding internal communications from the Fed.
We have to pause and recognize how wild that is. The executive branch using the criminal justice system to issue grand jury subpoenas to the independent central bank.
It's unbelievable. But the judicial branch forcefully intervened. A federal judge, James Boasberg, issued an incredibly scathing ruling that completely blocked those subpoenas.
Judge Boasberg's written opinion was remarkable for its directness. He stated unequivocally that there was zero evidence of any crime regarding the renovations.
Zero evidence.
Furthermore, he wrote that the dominant, if not the sole, purpose of the DOJ's investigation was to harass and pressure Jerome Powell.
To what end, though?
The goal, according to the judge, was to either force Powell to cut interest rates to the president's liking or to force him to resign entirely to clear the path for Trump's preferred nominee, Kevin Warsh.
Now, the DOJ has publicly stated they are appealing what they called an outrageous ruling. But regardless of the legal outcome, the political damage is already done. The gears of government have ground to a halt.
Because of the retaliation?
Yes. In direct retaliation for what he views as an attack on the institutional independence of the Fed, Senator Thom Tillis is currently blockading Kevin Warsh's nomination in the Senate Banking Committee.
Which means during one of the most complex global supply shocks of the decade, the leadership of the United States Central Bank is mired in gridlock and existential institutional conflict.
The systemic friction is immense.
It is. The markets hate uncertainty, and right now, the entity designed to provide macroeconomic certainty is under siege.
And the markets are reacting exactly how you'd expect. Prediction markets, like the Kalshi platform, have seen wagers for a U.S. recession in 2026 climb to 32%.
Which is the highest level we've seen all year.
People are literally placing bets that the system is going to crack under the pressure.
But while the politicians are battling over grand jury subpoenas and constitutional independence in the marble halls of Washington, the actual consequences of this paralysis are bleeding directly into the streets.
The real victims aren't macroeconomic models.
No, the real victims of the Fed's inability to lower rates are everyday consumers.
Right. If the Fed is frozen, interest rates stay high. And if interest rates stay high, the cost of borrowing money to live your life becomes suffocating.
It changes everything.
Which transitions us from the theoretical macroeconomy straight into the brutal consumer reality. We need to talk about what this means for housing, retail, and the desperate, almost frantic hunt for financial relief.
The most immediate and painful translation of this global uncertainty is found in the bond market, which dictates mortgage rates.
Okay, let's look at those numbers.
Because bond yields are spiking violently due to the unpredictability of the Middle East war and the domestic inflation data, mortgage rates have surged to their highest levels since September. We are currently looking at a national average of 6.41%.
Let's contextualize how fast that happened. Just 2 weeks prior to hitting 6.41%, mortgage rates had briefly dipped down and touched 5.99%. A jump of nearly 0.5% in 14 days is a massive shock to the system.
It fundamentally alters the affordability calculus.
Let's walk through the math for a normal person.
Yeah.
Let's say you are buying a median-priced home in the U.S. right now, which is roughly $400,000. You've saved up, you're putting 20% down. That sudden 2-week jump in interest rates just added $115 to your monthly mortgage payment.
Every single month.
For the entire 30-year life of the loan.
For millions of families overnight, that prices them out.
It's worse than musical chairs. It's a game of musical chairs where someone keeps taking away the chairs, but every time the music stops, they also increase the entry fee just to stand in the room.
That's entirely accurate. And because everyday buyers are being priced out, the builders are panicking and slamming the brakes on new construction.
What do the numbers look like for housing starts?
The January housing start data confirms this freeze. Single-family housing starts fell by 2.8%, dropping down to an annualized rate of 935,000. Construction of townhouses is completely flat at roughly 173,000 units. But the most alarming metric is the utter collapse of the built-for-rent sector.
Yeah, this is a fascinating anomaly in the data. Single-family homes that are specifically built by developers to be rented out rather than sold have crashed to just 15,000 starts in the entire fourth quarter. Why did that specific sector completely fall off a cliff?
Because of a massive legislative intervention that completely destroyed the financial model underpinning those developments.
What legislation?
There is a proposed bill moving through Congress right now that would force institutional builders and corporate landlords to sell these rental properties to individual homebuyers within a mandatory 7-year window.
Okay, on the surface, if you are a politician pitching that to your constituents, it sounds like a massive win for the middle class. We are going to stop Wall Street from permanently hoarding the housing supply and force them to sell these homes back to everyday families. I mean, it sounds like a great policy to fix the affordability crisis.
It sounds great, but it is a textbook example of the law of unintended consequences. To understand why it failed, you have to understand how institutional real estate development is financed.
Walk me through it.
When a massive developer decides to build an entire neighborhood of built-for-rent homes, they require hundreds of millions of dollars in upfront capital. They secure that capital from pension funds and institutional investors by promising a steady, predictable yield rental income spread out over a 20 or 30-year horizon.
So they build a massive spreadsheet that models out decades of rent collection to justify the massive upfront cost of laying the concrete, running the plumbing, building the streets.
Yep. Exactly. But the moment the government introduces a law mandating that the developer must liquidate the asset in 7 years, that entire financial spreadsheet flashes red.
Because the timeline is cut short.
Right. The internal rate of return drops below the cost of capital. The investors pull their funding because the long-term yield is gone, replaced by the short-term risk of a forced sale in an unpredictable future market.
So what happens? The developers don't build the neighborhood. They just pack up and allocate their capital to a different sector.
Right. The policy was intended to help everyday homebuyers by freeing up inventory down the road. But the immediate real-world effect is that those homes are simply never built in the first place.
The overall housing supply shrinks even further, which ironically exacerbates the very affordability crisis the legislation was trying to solve.
It's a classic policy misfire.
So the housing market is effectively frozen by high rates and structural policy errors. What about the retail sector? Because those stranded ships in the Strait of Hormuz aren't just carrying oil, the entire logistics network of the Middle East is disrupted.
Yeah, the supply chain contagion is spreading rapidly. Fast fashion brands like Zara are reporting significant disruptions, with massive quantities of seasonal garments literally stranded as commercial cargo flights through the Middle East are abruptly canceled due to airspace restrictions.
And if you are a retailer relying on a hyper-optimized, just-in-time inventory model,
A 2-week delay in transit means you completely miss the seasonal buying window.
and while the supply side of retail is struggling with logistics, the demand side, the consumer, is fracturing based entirely on income brackets. Analysts and our sources are pointing to the entrenchment of a K-shaped consumer economy.
Right, the K-shaped recovery model. It describes an economy where different segments of the population experience wildly diverging financial realities.
Break down the K for us.
The upper arm of the K represents higher-income consumers who own asset stocks, locked-in low-rate mortgages, and they are largely insulated from the inflation shock they continue to spend.
And the lower arm.
The lower arm represents the lower to middle-income consumers who don't own assets and are bearing the full, unfiltered brunt of 6.41% mortgages, $100 a barrel oil, and rising grocery bills.
And because that lower arm of the K is getting crushed, their shopping habits are changing drastically. Analysts predict that value retailers, companies like Walmart and Dollar General, are going to see massive windfall profits in the coming quarters as historically middle-class consumers are forced to trade down just to survive.
Costco is emerging as another massive beneficiary of this shift, and not just because of their bulk grocery pricing.
Right. It's because of their ancillary services, specifically subsidized gasoline.
Yes. In an environment where the Strait of Hormuz is driving up prices at the pump nationwide, the consumer calculation changes. People are suddenly willing to invest 20 to 30 minutes of their time idling in a massive line of cars just to access Costco's cheaper gas.
Time is being traded directly for marginal financial relief.
Exactly.
It is a desperate scramble for cash, and you can see that exact same desperation playing out right now in the IRS tax data. As we head into tax season, the average IRS tax refund is actually up 10.6% compared to last year.
Which is a huge jump.
It is. The average American getting a refund is receiving roughly $3,676.
That significant year-over-year jump is largely driven by the implementation of the new Trump administration tax policies, specifically the newly enacted tax breaks on overtime pay, the elimination of taxes on tipped wages, and the adjustments to the state and local tax or SALT and deduction limits.
Those legislative changes are translating into larger lump sum returns for working-class filers.
Bizarre.
For a family struggling with that 3.1% core inflation and the spiking mortgage rates, a $3,600 check is an absolute lifeline. But in a perfect microcosm of everything we are discussing today, there is a massive bureaucratic bottleneck preventing that money from actually reaching the people who need it most.
It comes back to systemic friction.
Always.
The IRS is currently operating under a mandate from a previous executive order designed to modernize government operations by phasing out all paper checks in favor of electronic direct deposits. It's an efficiency initiative.
Efficiency in theory, disaster in practice. Because millions of Americans are unbanked or simply don't trust giving the federal government direct access to their routing numbers, they requested paper checks anyway.
And how did the IRS respond?
By halting those refunds and mailing out over 830,000 bureaucratic warnings known as CP53E notices.
Ah, the CP53E notice. It effectively holds the taxpayer's refund hostage. It informs the filer that they have 30 days to go online, create a verified IRS digital account, and provide direct deposit information.
And if they fail to do so, or simply cannot navigate the digital verification process,
the IRS will eventually issue the paper check, but it triggers an automatic delay of an additional 6 to 10 weeks.
Put yourself in the shoes of that taxpayer for a second. You are working a tipped job or pulling massive overtime shifts. You are thrilled to learn your refund is over $3,000 because of the new tax laws.
Right.
You desperately need that liquidity today because your gas bill is climbing due to a war halfway across the world, and your rent is going up because developers stopped building houses. But because you missed a piece of mail, or because you don't have a traditional checking account, your financial lifeline is arbitrarily delayed for 2.5 months.
It is infuriating, and it highlights how fragile the consumer safety net actually is.
And that profound consumer vulnerability is driving some truly radical policy proposals in Washington regarding how to distribute corporate windfalls. Which brings us to the fascinating legal fallout surrounding the Section 122 tariffs.
This is a huge story that flew under the radar for a lot of people.
It really did. The Supreme Court recently handed down a major ruling that voided a massive portion of the Section 122 reciprocal tariffs that the Trump administration had previously implemented.
To clarify the mechanics here, Section 122 tariffs were essentially punitive taxes levied on imported goods from specific countries. When companies imported those goods, they had to pay billions of dollars to the U.S. government.
But those companies didn't just absorb the cost, they passed that cost directly down to the consumer in the form of higher prices at the register.
Right, but now that the Supreme Court has struck down those specific tariffs as legally invalid, the U.S. government essentially owes those importing companies a massive refund.
And the scale of this refund is difficult to comprehend. We are talking about an estimated $165 billion that might be handed back to these corporations.
Which presents a massive political dilemma.
Because the consumers are the ones who actually bore the economic pain of those tariffs for years through higher retail prices. But the corporations are the legal entities entitled to the $165 billion refund check from the Treasury.
Exactly. So how do you make the consumer whole?
Well, Senator Martin Heinrich has proposed a legislative solution, the tariff dividend check. His bill would authorize the government to send $1,200 direct stimulus checks to American families, plus an additional $600 per child, specifically designed to offset the higher costs they endured during the tariff period.
It's a direct attempt to inject liquidity back into the lower arm of that K-shaped economy.
But at the exact same time, the executive branch is taking a completely different, much more combative approach to this $165 billion windfall.
Yes, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer went on national television and launched a highly publicized pressure campaign against the specific companies that sued to get these refunds, massive logistics and retail giants like FedEx and Costco.
What was he demanding?
Greer publicly demanded that instead of keeping the $165 billion, these corporations should immediately distribute that windfall directly to their hourly workers in the form of massive bonuses and structural raises.
This creates a fascinating tension between political rhetoric and corporate fiduciary duty. USTR Greer is leveraging public opinion to shame these companies into redistributing wealth.
But from a purely mechanical corporate governance standpoint, do we realistically expect massive, publicly traded corporations to hand over billions of dollars to their labor force simply because a government official suggested it on a morning talk show?
It seems incredibly unlikely. I mean, if I am the CEO of a publicly traded company and a Supreme Court ruling just unexpectedly drops a multi-billion-dollar refund into my lap, my legal obligation is to my shareholders.
Right.
Historically, unexpected corporate windfalls of this magnitude aren't routed towards sweeping permanent employee raises. They are routed into massive stock buyback programs to artificially boost the share price or paid out as special dividends to the investors.
Exactly. The capital will naturally flow upward to the asset owners, not downward to the wage earners, which only further entrenches that K-shaped economic divide.
The working class is waiting 10 weeks for a delayed IRS paper check, while the corporate sector is actively figuring out how to absorb a $165 billion Supreme Court windfall.
It's quite the contrast.
And as a physical, tangible economy, the world of housing starts, retail shipping logistics, and paper checks grinds to this painful bureaucratic halt, the digital and tech economy is undergoing a massive, ruthless acceleration.
They aren't waiting for the Fed to cut rates or the Strait of Hormuz to clear.
No, they are aggressively engineering their way out of the bottleneck by fundamentally altering human labor. Let's talk about the tech transformation, the new microscopic architecture of AI, and the massive shuffle happening in Silicon Valley.
If we look closely at the hardware infrastructure being developed right now, we're witnessing a profound pivot in the evolution of artificial intelligence. We are transitioning out of the era of generative AI and entering the era of agentic AI.
And that shift requires entirely different machinery.
Yeah.
Let's break down the difference between those two concepts because it is crucial. Generative AI is what we've all been using for the last few years. It's a chatbot.
Right.
You ask it to write a polite email to your boss or generate an image of a cat riding a skateboard, and it spits it out. It is essentially a highly advanced, incredibly smart encyclopedia that responds to a direct prompt.
But agentic AI is fundamentally different. Agentic AI possesses agency. It doesn't just answer a question. It executes complex, multi-step workflows autonomously over time.
It's the difference between buying a really smart reference book and hiring an autonomous project manager. Generative AI writes the email. Agentic AI analyzes your company's Q3 sales data, identifies a weakness in a specific demographic, autonomously designs a 6-week targeted marketing campaign, purchases the ad space, launches the campaign, and monitors the analytics to adjust the spend in real time.
All without a human ever touching a keyboard.
It's mind-blowing.
And that capability requires a massive shift in semiconductor processing power. For the last half-decade, NVIDIA's graphics processing units, or GPUs, have been the most coveted technology on the planet. GPUs are designed to perform thousands of relatively simple mathematical operations simultaneously.
Give me an analogy.
If you imagine a stadium filled with 10,000 people and you ask them all to flip a coin at the exact same time to determine a probability, that is how a GPU trains a massive generative AI model.
But agentic AI doesn't just need simultaneous training. It needs complex, sequential orchestration. It needs to walk through a logical process step by step. It needs to remember what it did in step 1 to correctly execute step 4.
Exactly. If the GPU is a stadium of people flipping coins, the central processing unit, the CPU, is a single, brilliant detective meticulously walking through a crime scene, connecting sequential clues.
So agentic AI relies heavily on the CPU to manage and orchestrate these autonomous workflows.
And this shift in architecture is causing what supply chain analysts and our sources are calling a quiet supply crisis. Everyone was so focused on the shortage of GPUs that they missed the pivot.
NVIDIA is actually using its massive upcoming GTC conference to pivot industry focus onto its new proprietary CPUs, specifically the Grace and Vera architectures. They are literally deploying server racks in Meta's massive data centers that are comprised entirely of CPUs, with 0 GPUs included.
Meanwhile, the traditional legacy leaders in the CPU space, companies like AMD and Intel, are facing an unprecedented, completely unexpected surge in demand. The wait times for their high-end server processors are extending out to 6 months.
6 months.
Physical capacity of the global foundries to print these specific silicon wafers is absolutely maxed out. It's a massive hardware bottleneck.
But the hardware bottleneck is just the precursor to the much more terrifying human bottleneck.
Yeah.
We have to look at the human cost of deploying these autonomous digital workers into the economy.
Yes.
ServiceNow CEO Bill McDermott recently went on the record with a chilling warning about the mass adoption of agentic AI. He stated that over the next few years, these AI agents could push the unemployment rate for recent college graduates into the mid-30% range.
A 35% unemployment rate for educated entry-level workers is a catastrophic structural failure of the labor market. McDermott isn't just speculating, he's looking at his own internal data.
What does it show?
He noted that his enterprise software firm has already successfully automated 90% of the use cases that previously relied on human labor in Tier 1 customer service roles.
Think about the implications of that. If agentic AI is actively coming for all the entry-level white-collar jobs, the junior marketing assistants, the basic software coders drafting boilerplate algorithms, the customer service reps, the paralegals doing document review, how does the next generation ever enter the workforce?
They don't.
How does a 22-year-old gain the 5 years of foundational experience required to become a senior employee if the foundational jobs no longer exist?
It creates a hollowed-out corporate structure. Companies are discovering they can maintain their current senior headcount and actively grow their revenue by simply deploying software to handle the bottom-tier tasks.
But as you said, it burns the bottom rungs of the career ladder. And if a college graduate faces a 35% chance of permanent unemployment upon graduation, the entire financial calculus of the higher education sector collapses. Why take on $100,000 in student loan debt if the degree doesn't grant you access to the entry-level job market?
The disruption is total. And the startup ecosystem that is actively building the tools causing this disruption is undergoing its own massive, chaotic reshuffling.
Look at what Elon Musk is doing. According to the tech briefings in our stack, he is essentially rebuilding his artificial intelligence company, xAI, quote, from the foundations up.
He recently suffered a massive exodus of his original co-founders, so he is aggressively poaching top-tier engineering talent from specialized coding startups like Cursor to fill the void.
Musk is also leveraging his broader industrial empire to stabilize xAI. He is actively tying the AI company to a massive proposed $1.25 trillion merger with SpaceX, which is concurrently preparing for a highly anticipated IPO.
He's using hard aerospace assets to collateralize his software ambitions.
And while Musk tries to consolidate his empire, the broader banking infrastructure that has historically supported the entire Silicon Valley startup ecosystem has been quietly and entirely captured by traditional Wall Street.
We have to rewind 3 years to the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, SVB. SVD was the beating heart of the startup community. They understood founders, but when they collapsed in a bank run, the ecosystem panicked.
And JP Chase, the ultimate symbol of traditional conservative Wall Street banking, swooped in. The anecdote in our sources is perfect. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, was literally attending a retirement party when he got the emergency call from federal regulators that SVB was failing.
But instead of stepping in to buy the toxic, failing bank, JP Morgan made a much smarter strategic play. They just built a better mousetrap and absorbed the fleeing customers.
Over a single weekend, they gained 3 years' worth of new client acquisition. Today, they have successfully quadrupled their base in the innovation sector, posting nearly 12,000 startup clients.
They offer a comprehensive one-stop shop ecosystem that handles everything from a founder's initial seed capital round all the way through their eventual IPO.
But this massive consolidation raises a critical macroeconomic concern regarding the future of innovation. SVB was unique because they deeply understood the highly specific, incredibly high-risk nature of early-stage software founders. They were willing to take chances.
Right. JP Morgan, by its very nature and regulatory burden, is an inherently conservative, risk-averse institution.
So the question becomes, if the primary funding mechanism for the entire tech sector is now monopolized by a highly regulated Wall Street behemoth, does the culture of Silicon Valley become inherently more corporate and risk-averse? Are we going to see a chilling effect on the exact type of wild, high-risk innovation that drives the sector forward simply because a traditional bank loan officer doesn't understand the vision?
It is highly probable the homogenization of capital leads to the homogenization of ideas.
So, to synthesize where we are before we move to the final piece of the puzzle, the global supply chain is physically choking on a geopolitical conflict, driving up inflation. The Federal Reserve is paralyzed by that inflation and political infighting, keeping mortgage rates suffocatingly high. And the tech sector is rapidly deploying autonomous AI that threatens to erase a third of all entry-level jobs, while the funding for new companies is captured by conservative Wall Street banks.
Every day, people are feeling entirely cornered. The traditional paths to stability are eroding beneath their feet.
How are people actually coping with this pressure? That brings us to our final discussion. Escapism, the hustle, and fighting back.
When macroeconomic pressure reaches this level and traditional avenues for wage growth stall, humans inevitably adapt. They look for ways to cut costs, they organize to demand better terms, or they monetize their existing lives to generate immediate cash.
But right now, even the cost of basic escapism, the small luxuries we use to distract ourselves from the pressure, is rising.
It truly feels like we are being nickel and dimed on our downtime.
Absolutely. Look at Amazon. They are actively hiking the price of their ad-free Prime Video tier by $2 a month, pushing it to $4.99, calling it Prime Video Ultra. You are paying an escalating premium just to avoid watching commercials.
And it's not just streaming subscriptions, it's cultural institutions like live sports.
The NFL negotiations currently underway perfectly illustrate this dynamic. The NFL is actively attempting to eliminate an opt-out clause in their broadcasting contract with CBS, scheduled for 2029. To give up that clause, the NFL is demanding a staggering 50% price increase from the network.
If accepted, that would push CBS's annual bill to over $3 billion just for the right to broadcast Sunday afternoon football games.
$3 billion a year. And CBS isn't just going to absorb that cost out of the goodness of their hearts. They're going to pass that cost directly down to the consumer through higher cable carriage fees and more expensive streaming bundles.
This highlights the brutal reality of the current economy. Massive corporate monopolies like Amazon and the NFL possess absolute pricing power. They can simply dictate the terms and force the networks and the consumers to pay the toll.
But individual workers and everyday consumers do not possess that unilateral pricing power. They cannot simply demand a 50% raise to cover their increased mortgage costs. Because they lack individual leverage, they are forced to adapt structurally. For the working class, that means collective organization.
Right, look at the aggressive new posture of Starbucks Workers United.
The sources outline a comprehensive new labor contract proposal submitted by the union, and it is incredibly revealing.
Yeah.
Yes, they were asking for financial bumps, a $17 an hour starting wage, and guaranteed 4% annual raises. But the most critical demands aren't just about the hourly rate. They are about reclaiming structural control over their daily lives.
They are demanding a union-endorsed dress code, but more importantly, they are demanding strict staffing minimums.
The staffing minimum demand is the key. They want a contractual requirement mandating at least 3 workers on the floor at all times. This proves that the labor struggle isn't just about matching inflation. It's about combating the physical and psychological burnout caused by corporate efficiency models.
Companies are trying to protect their margins by chronically understaffing shifts during peak rush hours. The workers are utilizing the union to force the corporation to absorb the cost of adequate labor, rather than forcing the employees to absorb the stress of a skeleton crew.
They are fighting back to reclaim leverage in a system that views them as an expense to be minimized. But what about the millions of middle-class Americans who don't have a union? The people who suddenly have to come up with an extra $115 every single month just to cover the sudden spike in their 6.41% mortgage rate.
For them, the solution is the rapid, almost dystopian expansion of the rent-your-stuff economy.
When wages are stagnant and debt is expensive, the only remaining option is to monetize the physical assets you already own. The sources highlight 4 major platforms that are facilitating the micro-monetization of the American household.
It is both brilliant micro-entrepreneurship and incredibly bleak.
Let's run through them. First, you have platforms like Heglo. If you own a power drill, a specialized saw, or a high-end DSLR camera that sits in your closet most of the year, you can rent it out to your neighbors by the day.
Higlo takes a 20% commission off the top, but they cover the insurance if your neighbor breaks your lens.
Then you move up the asset chain to transportation. Turo allows individuals to operate their personal vehicles as an ad hoc rental car fleet. You hand the keys to your Honda Civic to a stranger arriving at the airport.
Turo takes a 7.5% fee and provides the liability insurance.
And then you reach the monetization of the home itself. Beyond just renting out a spare bedroom on Airbnb, which takes a standard 3% host fee while passing the bulk of the service charges onto the guest people, are now slicing up the specific amenities of their property.
Yeah, a platform called Swimply allows homeowners to literally rent out their backyard pools or their private tennis courts by the hour.
People are renting their backyards to strangers for children's birthday parties or commercial photo shoots. The platform takes a hefty 15 to 25% fee, but provides a $1 million protection guarantee.
This trend requires us to fundamentally reevaluate the nature of the sharing economy. A decade ago, renting out a spare room on Airbnb or driving for Uber was marketed as a fun, flexible way to earn vacation money or fund a hobby. It was supplementary income.
Today, it is rapidly transitioning into a structural requirement for basic middle-class survival. I have to ask, when you look at all these data points together, is this rent-your-stuff hustle a triumph of modern technology empowering the individual? Or is it a tragic symptom of the macroeconomic failure we've been unpacking this entire hour?
Well,
when I contrast the reality of the NFL casually demanding $3 billion in a corporate boardroom with the reality of a family spending their Saturday morning taking wide-angle photos of their backyard pool to rent to strangers just to generate an extra $100 to cover the inflated cost of groceries,
yeah.
it paints a very dark picture of where the leverage actually sits.
It suggests that the home is no longer viewed as a private sanctuary. It has been converted into an income-generating asset out of sheer necessity. If mortgage rates remain trapped above 6% because the Federal Reserve is fighting inflation, and that inflation remains sticky because 130 million barrels of oil are trapped in a geopolitical bottleneck in the Middle East, then renting your car on Turo or your pool on Swimply isn't a side hustle.
It is the only mathematical way that family avoids foreclosure.
Exactly. The macro dictates the micro.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. Look at the incredible, terrifying chain reaction we've tracked today. It starts with a physical blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, trapping 20% of the world's oil. That geopolitical friction creates a massive supply chain bottleneck, which violently spikes the cost of global energy and shipping.
That energy shock acts as a regressive tax, driving up domestic inflation from India to the United States.
And that inflation paralyzes the Federal Reserve. sparking a historic institutional war with the Department of Justice over interest rates. Because the central bank is gridlocked, bond yields spike, pushing local mortgage rates to 6.41%.
And because housing and basic goods are suddenly unaffordable, everyday consumers are squeezed into a K-shaped economy.
They wait 10 weeks for a delayed paper tax refund, and they are forced into the hustle economy, renting out their personal tools and backyard pools to strangers just to make ends meet. And they're doing all of this while looking over their shoulder at the rapid deployment of autonomous agentic AI that threatens to permanently automate their white-collar jobs out of existence.
It perfectly illustrates that in our modern, hyper-optimized global system, there are absolutely no isolated incidents. A tactical decision made by a military commander regarding a coral island in the Persian Gulf eventually, inevitably, dictates the terms of a Starbucks barista's labor contract, the wait time for an Intel processor, and the hourly rental rate of a suburban swimming pool.
Knowledge of these deep connections, understanding the underlying mechanics of how and why the pressure moves through the pipes, is truly the only way to navigate this landscape without being entirely overwhelmed by the daily barrage of disconnected headlines. We are officially entering an era of hyper-connected vulnerability. In our relentless pursuit of efficiency, we have handed so much of our physical supply chain over to incredibly fragile geopolitical choke points, and we are rapidly handing our digital workflows over to autonomous AI agents that we barely understand. So the ultimate question is, who is actually steering the ship? Take a look around your own industry this week, examine your own workplace, review your own household budget, and ask yourself, where is your hidden bottleneck? Because as we learned today, when that bottleneck finally gets squeezed, the pressure doesn't just disappear, it goes everywhere. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and remember to keep questioning the headlines.